Greetings once again, everyone. This is the first of two lectures on the topic of business ethics and pharmacy, and the intersection between these disciplines. The main purpose of this lecture is to just provide you with some background information about the field of business ethics and then allude to some of the connections that it has with the profession of pharmacy. The kind of broad theme in these last 2 weeks of the class is how does the fact that the pharmaceutical industry is situated in a capitalist economic system, how does that create problems for how the pharmacy industry and profession functions? So let's start with a common view in business ethics. It's a common view, but I think it's probably false. But it's been very historically influential and it's very sticky. You've probably not heard of it unless you've taken a business ethics course before. But here's the view. A lot of people think a person who works for a company, firm, organization, whatever, they've only really got two things they got to do. First, they got to obey the law. And second, they got to do whatever makes the most money. That's it. So what's your goal as an employee? Make as much money as possible for your boss and don't break the law. And that's it. Now, the duty not to break the law sort of originates from just general obligations we have as citizens. The duty to maximize profit comes from the fact that employers and employees are typically viewed as being, in some sense, indebted to the company's owners or shareholders. So the idea is you wouldn't have a job if it wasn't for those people. So you ought to do what is in their interests, right? You owe it to them. And what happens to be in their interests in most situations is making as much money as possible. So, in other words, what you want to do is take whatever action can get you as much money as possible without doing anything that's going to get your company sued or get a lawsuit brought against you, which, as it happens, can also be very bad if you're can hurt your public image. It can also, if you lose a lawsuit, it can just cost you money outright. So often, it's not going to be in your interest to break the law anyway. There are some notable exceptions to that. Some of you may be aware of that if you followed, scandals on Wall Street and things like that. There are plenty of situations where it seems like there may be exceptions, but in general, these two things will not. These two things won't usually conflict. There will not be that many situations where maximizing profit can be better attained by breaking the law than just obeying it like a normal citizen. The guy who came up with this, a guy named Milton Friedman. Now, if you Google the Friedman Doctrine, or if you Google Friedman business ethics or things like that, do be aware that you may get a false positive because there was another guy named another Friedman. It was spelled. His name was spelled differently. It was Freedman, but he was a critic of Milton Friedman, the guy who came up with the Friedman Doctrine. So it's freaking confusing if you don't keep that straight, you're going to run into some. So it's because you got articles where it's like Friedman is responding to Friedman. It's like, oh my God, what is happening? It's just a weird historical coincidence. But the article that is relevant here is Milton Friedman's The Social Responsibility of Business is to Increase Its Profits. Yes, that is the actual title. And yes, this is one of those articles where the thesis of the article is also the article title. So here's a representative quote from that article that kind of summarizes his position. This is the sort of the money quote where that view of business ethics is kind of derived. He says, in a free enterprise, private property system, a corporate executive is an employee of the owners of the business. He has direct responsibility to his employers. That responsibility is to conduct the business in accordance with their desires, which generally will be to make as much money as possible, while conforming to the basic rules of the society, both those embodied in law and those embodied in ethical custom. So, short version of this, what's sort of the grounding for this? Well, you want to do what is in your employer's interests. What's typically going to be in their interests is trying to maximize profit, but also being respectful of sort of generally established legal responsibilities and possibly ethical rules or customs, norms of a sort. So you may be, those could vary by the profession you're in or by certain other codes that are established. But the important thing to recognize here is that whatever moral rules are in play on this kind of view, they're pretty minimal. They are basically just limited constraints on this general objective to make as much money as possible. Now, I don't think that this view is right. I want to be clear about that. I think there are plenty of reasons to think that ordinary moral customs and the law just doesn't exhaust what morality's domain is. There are too many examples historically of unjust laws or situations where social norms were seemed like they were just deeply misguided or wrong, or in a lot of times just cases where those kinds of things don't really seem to cover everything that morality covers. So I mean, you're not really going to be typically punished or held legally responsible for, say, just being rude to somebody in a public context. No matter how unpleasant you may be as a conversationalist, that's just not the kind of thing that is in the purview of the law. And so you can be morally criticized for those kinds of behaviors, I think, but there's not going to be any repercussions if you don't change your behavior in most cases. I mean, sure, it might make you, have fewer friends or something like that, but that may not be a punishment. That may not be something that you really care about if you're that kind of person. So I think that this original standard that we started with, this is just too minimal. There are moral responsibilities that you have that go beyond these things, even in the context of business. At least that's my view. But I want to point out, if we adopt this perspective, I want to point out some problems that emerge when it comes to drug manufacturing and pharmaceuticals more generally. So, let's imagine that we have embraced the Friedman Doctrine. We really believe that what matters most is obeying the law and maximizing profits. What does this imply about the pharmaceutical industry? Well, since pharmaceutical companies are businesses, it would follow that their primary objective on this view is to maximize their profits, not to promote the best possible health outcomes for ordinary people. That's not the main objective. That may be something that happens as a result of trying to maximize profits, but it's not the central goal. Since the goal is to maximize profits, it follows that the drugs that we're going to prioritize researching, marketing, developing, and ultimately selling to consumers are going to be whichever drugs make us the most money. So, again, not the drugs that are going to lead to the greatest improvement in human well-being or, promote the best health outcomes for the greatest number of the population. No, it's going to be the ones that make us the most money. What drugs are going to make us the most money? Well, first, it's going to be drugs that have a large market, right? It's going to be drugs where that apply to ailments that lots of people have. So we want as many potential buyers for our product as possible. We also don't want drugs that are super effective, which is a kind of counterintuitive thought, perhaps. But if you have drugs that actually cure the clients of the ailments, then the drug is going to erode its own market. It's going to be too effective, so to speak. We're going to start out maybe with, say, 1 million buyers, but if the drug cures 50% of the people who take it, then all of a sudden we're down to only 500,000 people we can sell to. Maybe over time that erodes even further. That's not a good long-term strategy for making money. So we don't want to be developing drugs that will actually cure people of their ailments. And we also, other things equal, want to prioritize drugs that are cheap to research and manufacture. That's probably not going to be as significant as the first two factors on this list, because like a lot of the most profitable drugs will require some significant startup funds to go for. But if you had two drugs you were considering that were roughly equal on the other measures, you would prioritize the one that was cheaper to research and produce. Now, it's not hard to imagine that this leads to some problems in what's going on in the pharmaceutical industry. One of the biggest problems is orphan diseases. And orphan diseases are basically those that are really, really rare or just Now, you're probably putting together that this picture is not all that favorable for, promoting good health outcomes. It seems like there are going to be situations where this makes the pharmaceutical industry deviate a little bit from what its supposed main mission is. Here's one area where that is extremely obvious: orphan diseases. What's an orphan disease? Well, an orphan disease is one that is really, really rare or only common in the developing world. And so it's effectively ignored in the developed world, including the United States. But that's a very abstract definition. In the US, we've actually got something more specific on the books. It's a disease that affects less than 200,000 people, which by the numbers is going to be if you think about it this way, there are well over 300 million people in the United States. So 200,000 people. So if it were, if a disease affected 1 million people, that would still only be like 0.3% of the U.S. population. That'd be for 1 million. And this is 1/5 of that. So this is 1/5 of around 0.3% of the population. We are talking a very, very, very tiny percentage of the population, and some of these are much less than 200,000. Some orphan diseases you only have maybe 10,000 people in the entire country who have the illness. Now think about this. If you're trying to make as much money as possible, why in the world would you ever prioritize an orphan disease? There's just nobody to sell to, right? It's not going to be a profitable endeavor. So historically, if you go back 40, 50 years, that's exactly what was going on. There just were no orphan diseases that were researched. What you had instead was the development of orphan drugs. You had these were drugs that were theoretically could have been distributed. They were in some sense developed or able to be produced, but they were never put forward at a commercial level because it would not have been practical to scale up production and to do the necessary take the necessary steps to distribute them to the buyers, because there just weren't very many buyers. So what you had in a lot of situations was, people would recognize like, hey, this illness looks like it would be treatable if we were to actually invest in it and develop and fully develop the necessary drugs, but there's no financial incentive to do that. So people just didn't. This was an obvious problem for people who had orphan diseases because they had they just wouldn't be able to get the medical treatments that would help them the most, right? Just not a good situation for them. So this led us to the Orphan Drug Act of 1983. This act was specifically passed to try to change the financial incentives of pharmaceutical companies. So how do we do that? Well, we got two different ways we can change their financial incentives. The first way is we can help them increase their profit after they've developed the drug. The second way is we can decrease the costs of investment to make the initial process of engaging in the research on the orphan disease more viable. This act included provisions to do both. So after you develop your drug, you get 7 years of market exclusivity, which translates essentially to a temporary monopoly. You don't have any competition with respect to that drug once you come out with it. So this rewards people who research an orphan disease and come up with some kind of new medication for it. If you were a researcher or an academic who wanted to do work on an orphan disease, you could get grants from the government for it. You could also get subsidies for the actual development of the drug itself. And lastly, you could get your research and development on orphan diseases written off as a tax credit. So you could pay fewer taxes as a result of engaging in this particular kind of research. Now, this act in some ways was a really good thing because it helped us to ensure that people who had orphan diseases were not just always being left behind by the pharmaceutical industry. And it led to the development of a lot of new drugs and treatments that these people desperately needed, and it improved their quality of life significantly. But over time, the Orphan Drug Act wound up actually maybe being too successful. Now, what do I mean by too successful? Well, basically, it was too good at enabling pharmaceutical companies to make a profit off of orphan drugs. So one of the problems is with that temporary monopoly system, you get situations where orphan drugs cost hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. And even ones that are not that extreme, even if it's only tens of thousands of dollars annually, you're going to predictably have lots of people who need the drugs that can't afford them. So those people are not actually made better off as a result of this situation. They originally wouldn't have even had any drugs they could potentially buy, but now that there are drugs available, they're so expensive that they can't afford them anyway. So their situation, and some of these people, their situation has not improved from whether it was pre-Orphan Drug Act or now. It has not effectively improved because they still don't have access to the drugs. It's just that the obstacle now is their income rather than the availability of the drugs in the first place. The other big thing that's happened is that since the economic incentives have shifted, common ailments are now often given a lower priority than orphan diseases. But that is a weird result because remember, orphan diseases only affect 200,000 people or less. So you got ailments in the United States that affect tens of millions of people annually. And yet, those ailments are often not being prioritized as much as orphan diseases because orphan diseases get you, doing research in orphan diseases get you all these benefits and can potentially be much more profitable. So originally, we had a problem where we weren't prioritizing orphan diseases enough. Now we're prioritizing them too much. We're neglecting other ailments that affect a much larger number of people. And so there's a sense in which it's good that orphan diseases are not being totally neglected anymore, but it seems like the pendulum has swung too far back the other way. What's the lesson behind this kind of orphan drug situation? What's the takeaway here? I think the takeaway is this. It's very, very hard to bring the economics and the ethics into alignment in this kind of situation. Because those two things are pulling in different directions. They have different priorities. The ethical considerations involve the kind of stuff we've been talking about prior in the course, right? Those principles of biomedical ethics, promoting good outcomes for patients, respecting patient autonomy, trying not to cause harm to patients, and trying to ensure equal access and distribution of medical care. The economic objective is just to make as much money as possible and not get sued while doing it. So fundamentally, these two things, these broad moral aims and this economic aim, they are not always going to be in nice, neat alignment. They're often going to pull in different directions. It was great that we recognized in the 1980s that orphan diseases were getting neglected as a result of this tension, and that we tried to do things that brought the ethics and the economics more into alignment. But we did that at a cost, and the cost is now we've got a new problem. So we had one problem, we tried something to solve it, and we kind of solved it, but we created a new problem as a result. There are a number of reactions you can have to this kind of thing. One of which is you could just say, well, the economic system's just totally broken, and we gotta burn the whole thing down and start over. That's a way you can go, sure. It's probably hopelessly unrealistic because economic systems don't just get erased like that. They can gradually change over a very, very long period of time, but they don't just get radically transformed. We're probably stuck with the system we've got one way or the other in the short term, no matter what. The other reaction you can have is, okay, well, we got to find some kind of better way to work from within the system itself to fix this sort of problem. So one of our big questions, a couple of our big questions moving forward is, what are some changes that we can make to the existing system to solve problems like this, or at least to bring the ethics and economics closer into alignment? That's the broad question that we'll be trying to answer over these last 2 weeks in the course. We will admittedly only be kind of scratching the surface of it because it's a huge question and could be the subject of an entire semester course on its own. But that's where we're headed. I hope you'll listen to a couple of these lectures over the next 2 weeks, as I'll have more to say about this stuff. Before the next one, make sure you read Clayton Dalton's article Chronic, which talks about the Orphan Drug Act as well as a few other aspects of the pharmacy profession in the context of business. Anyway, I hope you're all staying safe, staying healthy. I know we're in kind of a bizarre situation with the course and with social life in general, but this will not last forever. We'll get through these next 3 weeks of the semester, and hopefully sometime in the summer we can kind of get back to business as usual.